Thank you for having me today and having the honor of speaking with and for the Hebrew University and its American friends, and John, wherever you are, congratulations. There's not time for Q&A, but I do want to answer one question that I invariably get when I'm at events like these, which is why, after many happy and productive years at the Wall Street Journal, I left to become a columnist with that newspaper to which some of you used to subscribe, the New York Times. And the answer, briefly, is that I was so sick of being hated at the Journal for my never Trump views that I thought I'd go to the Times so I could be hated for all of my other views. And I'm happy to say that so far the experiment is succeeding. I want to take the few minutes I have here to speak, to offer a set of remarks which I hope take a somewhat broader view, but the relevance of which I trust will be apparent. And the question that I want to address is, what is it exactly that makes a country great? Now, I can tell you a few things that don't make a country great. Possession of vast arsenals of vast stockpiles of nuclear weapons don't make a country great. Russia has the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world. It has an economy that is somewhat smaller today than Italy, and that's Italy in the midst of its economic distress. Population alone does not make a country great. India, China, and Brazil are the countries of the future and always will be the countries of the future. A few things that certainly don't make countries great, or people who aspire to have countries, are constant efforts to destroy, undermine, and terrorize their neighbors, whether it's by flying kites with incendiary devices to set fire to the fields of neighboring farmers, or diverting 350 truckloads worth of materials to build a single tunnel under a border in order to kidnap a soldier or kill the person in the neighboring country. What doesn't make a country great is recklessly putting your own people in harm's way so that you can then cynically try to take credit for propaganda coups when those people meet the harm that you intended for them. It doesn't make a country great when you elect a president to a 4-year term and he is currently serving the 14th year of that 4-year term. What I think all of us hope for is that one day Israel's Palestinian neighbors will light on a better path for making a real country great that is willing to live in peace with all of its neighbors, not just Israel, but Egypt and Jordan, and maybe learn something about what Israel has been able to do over the past 70 years to turn it into such an improbable and stunning success, not least with the help of the Hebrew University. Now, one thought that I wanted to offer you is, if we bore down on this question of making a country great, what would we say are some of the key attributes? And as I think about countries that have, in fact, succeeded improbably, and in fact the United States is one of those countries, Israel is another, what I really think are the attributes aren't really attributes per se, they're ways in which these countries answer certain questions. And since this is the Hebrew University, I wanted to suggest to you that there might be 4 questions that should play on our minds. The first question, and this should especially play on our minds today, is what is our attitude? What is the attitude of any given country toward foreigners, toward strangers, toward immigrants, legal or illegal. A few little facts should commend your attention. The United States has won a great plurality of the world's Nobel Prizes. It's wonderful. Of all of the Nobel Prizes won by American citizens, 35% of those Nobelists were foreign-born. Think about that. More than 1 in 3 Nobel Prize winners in America born somewhere else, immigrants. If you look at the Fortune 500 companies, over 40% of them had founders who were either immigrants or the sons of immigrants. That goes for Google, it goes for Apple, it goes for Comcast, it goes for eBay, it goes for companies whose revenues in 2016 accounted for $4.8 trillion, which is roughly the equivalent of the gross domestic product of Germany. There's something called or used to be called the Westinghouse Science Competition. I think it's now the Intel Science Competition. It's called the Junior Nobel Prize. The last time I checked, 83% of the winners of the Junior Nobel Prize in the United States were immigrants or the children of immigrants. Immigrants start businesses in America at twice the rate of native-born Americans. They are our most entrepreneurial people by far. And here's a detail that I think ought to stick in the minds of some people. Immigrants commit crime, legal immigrants commit crime at half the rate, and illegal immigrants at 1/3 the rate as native-born Americans. So if you want a source of human capital, of national renewal, of demographic growth, of optimism, of a can-do spirit, countries that are great welcome their immigrants. And they welcome all of their immigrants. Yesterday I was on Meet the Press, and I had an opportunity to sit on a panel with 4 journalists along with Chuck Todd. 2 of those journalists were refugees, and the other one, me, was the son of a refugee. I'd like to wonder what would happen if my mother, who came to this country with $10, and her mother, the 2 of them, in 1950, had to face some of the conditions that some of the migrants today face today. Would I be standing here and speaking to all of you? So what makes a country great is the question of whether it understands that its newcomers, high and low, with skills, without skills, are assets to be seized and appreciated and honored, or are they threats and liabilities to be kept away across a wall or put into detention centers? That's the question number 1. What is our attitude toward foreigners? By the way, since I'm at this event, 26% of Israelis are foreign-born. Of the countries of the OECD, only Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Australia have a greater share of a population that's foreign-born. Israel is number 4. The most successful country in the Middle East by far happens to have the largest foreign-born population, and many of these people did not come from the Upper East Side of Manhattan. They came from Yemen, they came from Iraq, they came from Libya, they came from Tunisia, they came from places that were sometimes described as countries with an S at the beginning of them. So bear that consideration in mind. Second issue, second question that I want to put to you today. What is our national attitude toward independent thinking? One of the things that I fear the most, at least when I think about the United States, is that our willingness to tolerate the social nuisance, the gadfly, the contrarian. Mark very kindly mentioned the word contrarian in his bio about me. That tolerance for those people, those outliers on the edges, is diminishing. To give you a few examples, an engineer at Google writes a polite memo suggesting that maybe the company is going about its gender policies the wrong way. It's based in research, reasonably sound. He's fired. Football players take a knee and protest at what they believe is police brutality in football stadiums, or police brutality in America, and they take a knee in football stadiums, and the Vice President of the United States ostentatiously walks out on them. A biology professor at Evergreen State College, a Bernie Sanders voter by the name of Bret Weinstein, decides that he doesn't like a policy in which all white people are supposed to get off campus for a day. And he and his wife end up being hounded off the campus. And a center-right columnist for a major metropolitan newspaper writes a column with a slightly dissenting view on climate change, and 40,000 people sign a petition demanding that his employers fire him. Fortunately for me, the employers have so far resisted those calls. Now, this should matter to us because you will find that wherever there's progress, scientifically, legally, socially, in all the issues that we care most about, it doesn't come from people who are operating inside the consensus. It doesn't come from people who say, I agree. It comes from the people who say, I disagree. Natan Sharansky disagreed. Rosa Parks disagreed. Harvey Milk disagreed. The word I disagree, the words I disagree, I refuse, even if all the others do, I will not. These are the words that define and give life to a democratic and liberal society. And every time I open the pages of Haaretz and I tear my hair out because I disagree with so much I'm reading in it, I'm reminded that it's the very fact of that disagreement, the very fact that in Israel you have a democracy that is constantly, energetically, and sometimes even joyously screaming at itself, that is the source of so much vibrancy, so much intellectual yeast and ferment. And where else do you find that more beautifully than on the campus of Hebrew University, as you just heard described, with that wonderful combination of lawyers from different parts of Israeli society. So that's your second question. What is our attitude towards free and independent thinking? Do we embrace it as necessary, or do we reject it as dangerous? Third question, what is our attitude toward failure? Just about a month ago, at the ripe old age of 101, we lost one of the great historians of the Middle East, someone who knew Hebrew University quite well, and that was Sir Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis wrote a prophetic book about 2 decades ago, written before the events of 9/11. It was called What Went Wrong. It was an analysis of what had gone wrong in so many Middle Eastern societies. He said something, I just jotted it down, I hope I can read my handwriting, but he said something that really is worth thinking about. He said, when people realize that things are going wrong, there are 2 questions that they can ask. 1, what did we do wrong? 2, who did this to us? The latter question, he wrote, leads to conspiracy theory and to paranoia. The first question leads to an altogether different line of thinking. How do we put it right? Now, for generations, America has been famously a country of second chances. But second chances only make sense once you're willing to own the mistakes that you yourself have made. I worry today in the United States whether our attitudes toward failure aren't shifting in the wrong direction. They shift in the wrong direction when we try to explain failure by looking at statistical artifacts and saying that there is some problem with the system that is overriding my personal agency, my ability to change things. And I worry also when suddenly we alight on the theory that what's going wrong in American society isn't our own fault. It's a deep state. It's a conspiracy. It is the agents of American law enforcement and the Justice Department and the FBI who are conspiring against the will of the American people. That kind of thinking is exactly the kind of thinking that has led so many states in the Middle East to ruin. Because what's problematic in Egypt isn't that they lack natural resources, or in Jordan. What's problematic in Saudi Arabia isn't that they have so many natural resources. What's problematic is they have cultivated a line of thought which constantly seeks to find scapegoats and culprits in other groups, religious minorities, strangers, and most particularly in Jews. Now, Israel has chosen a different path for itself. I was in Israel in 2006 during the war with Lebanon, the war with Hezbollah, which did not go well. Israel made fundamental mistakes. But what's important to bear in mind is that Israel learned from those mistakes. And Israel today is infinitely secure because it had the confidence and the intelligence to understand that its attitude towards failure ultimately was going to determine its ability to succeed. I know Israelis have this in their bones. It is central to what Israel is, a country and a people constantly owning their failures. I hope this remains true of the United States as well. Final point that I want to make, which is what is our attitude toward leadership and toward our values. You know, 2018 is the 70th anniversary of two touchstone events in American foreign policy, both of which occurred in 1948. 1948, Harry Truman was faced with the decision as to whether to save West Berlin, which was then being blockaded by Joseph Stalin, where there were a little outpost of freedom and of American, French, Allied power, British power, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. If you thought about foreign policy in a purely transactional way, if you thought that foreign policy was merely a matter of deal-making, of asking what is in it for us and what is in it for us right now, it would be insane to undertake the policy that Truman ended up pursuing, which was to order the relief through an airlift of West Berlin. And yet Truman did it because he believed that American honor demanded it, and more importantly, that American values demanded it, that we were not going to forsake this enclave of freedom, however distant or difficult to defend it might be. Now just think about it. Truman did that in 1948, and 41 years later, in 1989, the United States won the Cold War, the great confrontation of the 20th century, without a life being lost or a shot being fired, because we had helped stand up this enclave and advertisement for what a free society was and could be, and what tyrannical communist societies weren't and would never be. And all East Germans had to do was look across the wall and say, "We want that." And all they had to do was breach that wall. And that's how we ended up fulfilling our deepest interests of the 20th century, because Harry Truman made a decision 41 years earlier that he would define American interests according to our values rather than our values according to our interests. Now, Truman made another decision in 1948, in May of that year, and again, it was an improbable, crazy decision that from a purely transactional, shall we say, real estate point of view, made no sense whatsoever. That is, he was going to recognized the one state in the Middle East that had no oil, the one state in the Middle East that was hated by all of its neighbors, the one state in the Middle East whose people seemed oddly altogether too sympathetic to our enemies in the Soviet Union. He was going to do so because he believed that the United States had a moral commitment to the Jewish people that was unbreakable and that should matter. And Harry Truman recognized the state of Israel 12 minutes after its declaration against the advice of his Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, and his Secretary of State, the great, famous, beloved George Marshall. And if you fast forward 70 years and ask yourself, have American interests been well served because Truman made a values-based decision in May of 1948 to recognize Israel? I'd say the answer is pretty clearly yes. And everything that you're doing in this room testifies to that fact, that in Israel we have not just a democracy, not just a liberal democracy, not just a liberal democracy that's good at fighting terrorism, but a liberal democracy that is every single day enriching every field of human, artistic, scientific, legal, scholarly endeavor. That is one thing we can say about Israel that we can't yet say about any other country in Israel's neighborhood. No decision better served America's interests in the Middle East than that decision by Truman to recognize the state that everyone thought was sure to lose and would disserve vital American interests in the Middle East. At the end of the day, since I'm talking about values, American as well as Jewish values, we ought to think about what our values, what those values really are, what they're all about. Because after all, we ourselves were strangers in Egypt. And so we ought to know at the deepest level what it means to be a stranger in another person's land and the obligations we owe those poor and indigent people who, after all, as they come across the border in Nogales and El Paso and so on, don't look so different from my mother and grandmother coming to this country as displaced persons and Holocaust survivors after the war, or probably many of your ancestors too. We are the people of David who failed and failed and failed again. That is David's legacy, the understanding that you can fail and that you can still stand up and still make something of yourself. We are the people of Abraham, who was the very first, or at least the original, iconoclast when it came to rejecting the ideas of other people and pursuing his own light and his own path. And finally, we're the people of Moses, who, if nothing else, understood that he too was prepared to spend 40 or 41 years in the desert by putting values above interests, his own not least, and leading his people to safety and to freedom. That is what we are doing here today, all these centuries afterwards. That's what you're doing in this room. Thank you for coming today, and I hope I've kept my time. Thank you very much.